Mrs. Brown stood up. "Good. Now, Paddington, I have to meet our little daughter Judy off the train. I'm sure you must be thirsty after your long journey. So you go along to the buffet with Mr. Brown, and he'll buy you a nice cup of tea." Paddington licked his lips. "I'm very thirsty," he said. He picked up his suitcase and pulled his hat down firmly over his head. "Now, Henry, look after him," Mrs. Brown called after them. "And for goodness sake, take that label off his neck. It makes him look like a parcel." Mr. Brown found a table for two in a corner of the buffet. By standing on a chair, Paddington could just rest his paws comfortably on the top. "Well, Paddington," said Mr. Brown, as he placed two steaming cups of tea on the table and a plate piled high with cakes, "how's that to be going on with?" Paddington's eyes glistened. "It's very nice, thank you. Do you think anyone would mind if I stood on the table to eat?" Before Mr. Brown could answer, he had climbed up and placed his right paw firmly on a bun. It was a very large bun, the biggest and stickiest of all, and in a matter of moments, most of the inside found its way onto Paddington's whiskers. Mr. Brown stirred his tea and looked out of the window, pretending he had tea with a bear on Paddington Station every day of his life. "Henry," it was Mrs. Brown's voice, "Henry, whatever are you doing to that poor bear? Look at him. He's covered all over with cream and jam, and he's got his nose stuck in a paper cup." Mr. Brown jumped up in confusion. "He seemed rather hungry," he answered. Mrs. Brown turned to her daughter. "This is what happens when I leave your father alone for 5 minutes." Judy clapped her hands excitedly. "Oh, Daddy, is he really going to stay with us?" Paddington suddenly became aware that people were talking about him. He looked up to see that Mrs. Brown had been joined by a small girl. He jumped up, meaning to raise his hat, and in his haste slipped on a patch of strawberry jam. He waved his paws wildly in the air, and then, before anyone could catch him, he somersaulted backwards and landed with a splash, with one foot in his cup of tea. The tea was still very hot, and he jumped up again and promptly stepped into Mr. Brown's cup. Judy laughed until the tears rolled down her face. "Oh, Mummy, isn't he funny?" she cried. "He looks as though he's wearing Wellington boots." "You wouldn't think," said Mrs. Brown, "that anyone could get in such a mess in so short a time." Paddington took off his hat and started to fill it with the remains of the cakes. Mr. Brown coughed. "Perhaps," he said, "we'd better go. I'll see if I can find a taxi." Paddington stepped gingerly off the table, and Judy took one of his paws. "Come along," she said. "We'll take you home, and you can have a nice hot bath. Then you can tell me all about South America." When they came out of the buffet, Mr. Brown had already found a taxi, and he waved them across. The driver looked hard at Paddington, and then at the inside of his nice, clean taxi. "Bears is 6 pence extra," he said, gruffly. "Sticky bears is 9 pence. "He can't help being sticky, driver," said Mr. Brown. "He's just had a nasty accident." The driver hesitated. "All right, hop in." Paddington stood on a tip-up seat behind the driver, so that he could see out of the window. Mr. Brown leaned forward. "Number 32, Windsor Gardens." The driver cupped his ear with one hand. "Can't hear you," he shouted. Paddington tapped him on the shoulder. "Number 32, Windsor Gardens," he repeated. The taxi driver jumped at the sound of Paddington's voice and narrowly missed hitting a bus. He looked down at his shoulder and glared. "Cream," he said. "All over me new coat." "Oh dear," thought Paddington. "I'm in trouble again." Judy giggled and gave his paw a friendly squeeze. "I think I'm going to like staying with the Browns," thought Paddington. There are other stories in this series about Paddington. They are Paddington Takes a Bath, Paddington's New Room, Paddington Goes to the Sales.